All right, so Claire is going to talk about Lisa Meitner. So why don't you proceed, Claire?
Okay, so this first
Just a minute, let me hang on a second before I need to find out if I've got the I'm looking for the camera screen. There you go. Okay, you're on with the camera. That's good. Okay, you can proceed now.
So this first presentation is going to focus on her early life and education up until about World War I, and then I'm planning to go more depth through scientific discoveries for my next. Sorry, do you mind?
I do, we'll do that.
Okay, so she was born in Vienna on November 7th, 1878. She's one of the third out of 8 kids. Her father was a lawyer, her mother a physician. So she had a pretty comfortable living early childhood. They actually lived in a community in Vienna that was originally a ghetto. So her family themselves were Jewish, like ethnicity, they didn't associate with the religion they didn't practice. And so childhood was pretty good. She developed an early interest in math and piano, probably influenced by her mother. And unfortunately, though, she wasn't able to attend school after the age of 14. Just for last continue. And so the father, though, was very insistent that his daughters receive the same education as his sons. And so he paid her, she had 2 sisters, paid for private tutoring for actually, but homeschooling. So she just continued on with her math and piano and then other studies that she was interested in. And then around this time, Vienna kind of became a center of research for physics. Around the turn of the century, there was a great demand for social and economical demand of modernization. So physics was a big part of that. And Christian Doppler became the head of the Physics Institute in Vienna. So I can later study that. So there was a lot going on about the time that she was born and started going into school.
And so he was at this institute?
Yes, that's exactly what that was.
Okay, good.
So though she had stopped formal schooling at 14 to continue her studies, and then she wanted to attend university, but her father suggested that she get the qualifications to become a teacher first, just to have something on her resume, have a little bit of experience. So he paid for her to obtain her teacher qualification. She did so in French in 1899, and then 2 years later, she enrolled in the University of Vienna at the age of 23. And her professor there was Ludwig Boltzmann, and he had a really big influence on her. Initially, she still had that love for math, but one of her early math classes, she kind of realized math wasn't her calling. And Boltzmann was known for having really good relationships with the students, caring about them as a person, and so he was a really big influence for her to decide to study physics, and that became her passion. And then she became the second woman to receive a PhD in physics from the University of Vienna in 1906. And that picture of her, I think, was really popular just because it shows like how tired she was. She has dark under eyes and just how exhausted she was for all the work that she had put in.
By the way, Boltzmann is a famous physicist. He's the father of statistical mechanics in physics, which is now the basis of thermodynamics, how we understand temperature and energy and entropy and all that. But he also was bipolar, right?
Yes.
And you're going to talk about that?
Yeah, he was bipolar, struggled with mental illnesses, and he committed suicide shortly after his first year, I think, after she had him. And that kind of had a big effect on some of the students. But her personally, I was reading, she said that, of course, she was sad and everything. She kind of almost expected it, how she could at least tell how sick he was. So after she graduated, she worked as a high school physics teacher for a while, and she actually reached out to Marie Curie. There's any positions for her in Paris, but there weren't. So then she reached out to Trump and asked if she could attend the lectures at the University of Berlin. Said yes. And so her father now is still paying for her to go. She's not financially independent yet. So she moved to Berlin and she goes to study radioactivity. And soon after, she met and became lab partners with Otto Hahn. And they actually met in a carpenter shop because as a woman, she wasn't allowed to do the lab space. She went off campus. And they had a very formal but close relationship for many years. Hahn said how just very strict and ladylike she was. They never had lunch outside of lab. It was always just very formal. And she got along pretty well in Berlin. She was invited to all of the Planck, especially like kind of took her with him to all the big physics parties and such. But she wasn't really given any formal status because she was a woman. However, Einstein did call her the German Marie Curie, so she did have people recognize her, just not formally. So after working with Hahn for a while, they discovered the radioisotope of actinium in 1908, and then the radioactive recoil in 1909, which I'll discuss further in the next presentation. But soon after, she started to realize the dangers of working with radioactive materials. So like Marie Curie's situation, you always heard Lisa put in strict guidelines for herself to not put herself in harm's way. So also on a personal note, in 1908, she converted to Protestant, she was Lutheran, and one of the sources had a really good point about this and said that she must have done it for personal reasons because even if she wasn't Jewish, she didn't identify as anymore, being a woman, so she's still lower in the social status. This was probably most likely just her personal reasons for doing that. And then a little later, after being in Berlin in 1912, she began working as a paid assistant to Planck. It was very tiring work. She's kind of like a assistant to writing papers, not being in the lab, which is what she really enjoyed. And then in October that same year, she started working for Hahn at the high school in chemistry, and she was paid there a year later. So all about this time, Great War is starting. Austria-Hungary and Germany declared war against Russia, Japan, and Great Britain and France declared war against Austria-Hungary and Germany. There's a lot of other places that declared war against each other, but those just most pertain to Lisa. And one thing I thought was really interesting, we talked about the Haber process here, but that Planck and several other scientists and scholarly people signed these declarations or wrote these big things that were really just pushing for united Germany, that they actually had quite a big voice during the war during that time. And then Meitner herself volunteered to become an X-ray nurse and work on the front lines opposite Marie Curie. And that was just kind of hard work for her because she was working with Polish doctors who she didn't understand Polish and they didn't really understand X-rays like she did. So it wasn't quite the best fit. She later returned to work. And that's what we got next time. Questions?
So what did her father do?
He was a lawyer.
Lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
So they had enough money to support her.
Yes. Yeah. They, like I read, they went on vacations. There's always wasn't a lot of money since there's 8 kids, but
How many kids?
8.
8 kids. Wow. Wow. And was her father Jewish or her mother Jewish?
I believe it was her mother, not both of them. Her mother was originally, I think, Russian, and then she moved to Austria.
Yeah, I think it was just one parent was Jewish.
Yeah.
But it was enough.
Enough. Yep.
Now, she never did marry, did she?
No. And she never, I forgot to mention, she never returned to Vienna when she moved to Berlin. She didn't know at the time, but she never returned.
Very good. You know, there was a play. You read about the short play written?
No, you told me this is a
One-act play. And this was kind of on the heels of Copenhagen, the play about Heisenberg, and Bohr. And then somebody, maybe the same guy, I forget now. But somebody wrote a one-act play about Lisa Meitner. And actually, when I was working at Oak Ridge as deputy director, I organized a reading of it. We didn't do a play, but we had a reading of it at ORAL. I think it was just 3 or 4 main characters. So, she's a very interesting lady.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you, Claire. Ray, what is on your mind today?
I have 2 things. One, that play you mentioned.
Come on up.
That play you mentioned about Lisa Meitner.
Yeah.
How long is that, the text?
Oh,
Not very long.
not very long. It's
It might,
an hour at most.
I would love to get a copy of it, so I'm going to search.
Okay, well, I know who I appointed to be Lisa Meitner.
Okay.
And it was Bonnie, you met Bonnie at the Royal.
Carol?
Bonnie Nestor.
Bonnie Nestor.
She still works for lab director at ORNL. She was Lisa Meitner. I'm sure I've got it on my computer. I'll find it.
Good. We can at least put a summary of it in Historically Speaking and publish it.
That's a good idea.
I'd be glad to do that. I'd like to bring you some information about what's happening in Oak Ridge today. But I'd also like to do 2 other things. One is mention Leona Woods, and we've mentioned her in here as being with Fermi. She was at age 23, the youngest and only lady that was there at the time. She also went out to Denver and solved a very serious problem with the reactors out there, xenon poisoning. So just put a note in your mind that you might want to learn more about Leona Woods. And we'll leave that there and tell you as a preview of coming discussions. And Lee, you might want to include this in thinking about which videos they watch. There are 2 of them on there that are about the biology. And both of them have Leanne Russell featured in them. So if you want to include that in our thinking over the next several weeks about which ones to focus them on, I would recommend those 2. Now, quickly, I'm going to tell you some things that are happening in Oak Ridge right now. Okay? Just this is Thursday, so Monday of this week, I was interviewed by a television series that's going to be coming out probably in November, December timeframe. It's called The Unseen World. So just put that up there, and when it comes out, I'll obviously tell you about it again. But it was an interesting interview because these folks have picked a few places that they think have enough secrecy associated with them that they can make a television series out of. One of them. The other thing that's happening in Oak Ridge is there's a ghost hunter in Knoxville, J. Mark Smith. He has ghost tours. He's really an avid historian, but he uses this ghost tours technique to take people to historic places. So he came over to Oak Ridge, and I took him on a tour. I took him out to the African burial ground. I took him to John Hendricks' grave and up to the guest house. And he's looking for how he might include Oak Ridge in his ghost tours. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. But it was fun to see him trying to find something that he could make a story around that he could include in the book. Finally, the last
What's
thing
his name, Ray?
J. Mark Smith.
And he's in Knoxville?
He's Knoxville. And it's J. Mark Smith.
Okay.
And he has some pretty effective ghost tours every year. And has been on TV some. So he's well known in that arena. Now, the other thing is the American Museum of Science and Energy. I'm leaving here early today because we're getting almost to the point of having it open. We're going to do some tours of folks this afternoon and tomorrow that are special groups that we want to let come to the first. But the museum is going to open on next month, October 1st. It'll be a soft opening, but it'll be open to the public. And then there's a grand opening scheduled for October 18th. And they'll have dignitaries come in and make a big deal about it. But you need to know that we've moved that museum from its older location over to the Main Street location. And in doing so, it's gotten smaller. So the things that could not be moved from the old location, we've taken and collected into another location, the Midtown Community Center, and we've created a third museum in Oak Ridge. So you've got the Children's Museum where the National Park is located, got the American Museum of Science and Energy, which now focuses more on science than it does on history. And we created the Oak Ridge History Museum that's in an original World War II and we're getting that started. So.
And where is that going to be? Where
Well,
is
that's in the Midtown Community Center, 102 Robertsville Road. That's where the Oak Ridge History Museum is located. I've taken 2 tour buses through there, one of 54 and another of 40 people. And they just raved about it. They really enjoyed it. But you got to know that's the only place I took them in Oak Ridge, so they didn't have anything to compare it to. But they were excited to learn.
Is that where the Science and Energy Museum used to be?
No, that's where it was a recreation hall, and it was the Midtown Community Center. The old museum that opened in 1949 was on Jefferson Avenue. It was in a cafeteria,
Oh, yeah.
which is a very similar building. And then in 1974, it moved to the new building at that time, at the location where it's been up until just now. And now it's moved over to Main Street, what was the old Sears building, remember back, that far back. So that's a little bit of current events going on in Oak Ridge that I'll use it for that. Yes.
Have you ever actually
We've had paranormal folks come out and go through a couple of the churches that are out there. They spend the night going through it. We had them to go through the guest house again. And if you've ever been on one of those tours, what they do is they take a radio receiver, an RF receiver, and they'll turn it on, and they'll walk around with that thing on, and they'll be listening for something, any change in static, that sort of thing. I did one in Savannah, my grandson. And almost every time you go, you've got 20 people, and they've all got these little radios, somebody's just going to say something. Now, you got to really know, you've got to listen. It'll make some noise, and you can make a voice out of it. I don't believe those. Yeah.
I just want to add something to that. I went to high school in Oak Ridge.
Okay.
And there's a rumor that you go up to the African burial ground, and you go in your car and you turn all the lights off your headlights and stuff. It's really big. You're running the ghost will like come and flash your headlights. I tried it, it didn't work, but like my friends have tried it, especially worked for them. So like there is like some cases, I mean, it's all lying. But
He loved that African burial ground, and I can understand.
Is this a proportion of how much beer you've consumed, I wonder?
probably, I have no idea. But yeah, there are rumors about ghosts.
Now, there is a route you can take from Jackson Square that'll take you down to the Civic Center, which is in the middle of town. And you can ride a bicycle, and it's through the sewer system. So eventually, we're going to get part of that in the tour, I guarantee you. Can get some good fun. But, just fun to think about it. I don't know if anything will ever come over it.
An underground? bicycle?
Big, large sewer, it's storm drain system.
Yeah.
And it's large enough that kids have ridden small bicycles.
Huh.
When we did the book Bones of Betrayal, Dr. Bass and John Jefferson. John went down and walked through that to include it in his book.
So Ray, should we try to organize a tour for these 6 bright young people for one of your places there you
Yeah.
mentioned?
Yeah, well, now we've got one for the 14th.
Yes.
I've got that in place. I need to bring you a form so we can get the information needed for back. And I'll do that next time.
Okay.
And so we'll do that tour. We can do the History Museum tour if you'd like a second tour. Or I think we'd add too much time. What do you think? Try to do the graphite reactor.
Right, it'd be hard to do all of those in one day, but perhaps we should organize a second day.
I think that might be worth it, if there's enough
Yeah,
interest in
if you want to do that.
And we could do some of the, we could go visit the African burial ground, turn our lights off.
Where's the African burial ground?
It's out near K-25. Near the East Tennessee Technology.
Huh.
Just across the road.
Did you know about that?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever turn your lights off?
Not yet, right.
But I may try it.
Try and let me know.
There's a huge marker there, stands about this tall. People leave every.
Huh.
And you can just imagine what you find. Coins,
So this is where African Americans are buried?
yes.
Because they
slaves
could-
in there.
They couldn't be buried in a white cemetery.
They couldn't back
Right.
then.
How about that?
Okay. All right, I'm gonna slip out on you and go open the M's up.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try and figure out, Ray, how to measure ghost on my, is there an app?
Of course.
Actually,
it's
there
an
is.
app for everything.
I guarantee you there's a back for it. Isn't there? So he said it.
What it does, I'm pretty sure it's just, picks up scanner that picks up signatures.
Yeah.
So, if you scan it, so something.
Oh,
Everybody said it's yes.
How about that? Thanks, Ray.
We'll see you.
Okay, bye. Well, by 1941, things were really happening rapidly. And I mentioned this before. So a crucial step was the discovery of plutonium. Around 1940 at Berkeley by Fred Seaborg, Nobel Prize laureate. And then they maybe 41. Well, before 1941, then they realized, Lawrence did the measurements, that plutonium-239 is a better fissionable isotope than uranium-235. So this was a big discovery, that if you could make plutonium-239, if you could create it, if you could fabricate it and separate it, it'd be an even better fission source than uranium-235. And so this was a big step forward. Now, of course, everyone understood right away the problem with plutonium, it does not exist in nature, so you have to breed it, make it. In a reactor, for example, if you could build a reactor. The problem with uranium-235 is it's only 1 out of 140 atoms in the ground in natural uranium is this isotope with fissions. So then you have to enrich it. You have to separate it. So there are technical problems all around. The British were moving fast. The British were moving much faster in understanding the potential of a bomb based upon fission, much faster than the Americans. Maud was the report that the committee in England that was working on the uranium set of issues. And they sent their report to Vannevar Bush, who was one of the leaders of the uranium committee in the US, saying that you could probably make a bomb with as low as 25 pounds of fissionable material, that you could probably build a gaseous diffusion plant in order to enrich uranium in isotope 235. Maybe you could enrich a kilogram a day at a cost of 5 million pounds. Perhaps you could do all this by the end of 1943. And so it was the British group of scientists plus government officials that were pushing ahead, thinking this is possible. At the same time, things were moving in Germany, and Fritz Houtermans was an interesting guy involved in this evolution of thought. So he was Dutch. His mother was Jewish. Came to Germany to Göttingen. Remember, that's where Oppenheimer got his PhD about the same time, maybe a little bit later. Got his PhD, and then he, and a smart guy, nuclear physicist, interested in the newfound properties of the nucleus. Maybe was the first to realize that it's fusion, nuclear fusion, that drives stars. That had been a conundrum also. People assumed before this time that stars would shine, would burn, would give off energy by gravitational collapse. But then you can calculate pretty easily that they couldn't be billions of years old if that's how they were emitting energy. So he was perhaps the first to realize that maybe nuclear fusion is responsible for how stars burn. That indeed is the case. He was Jewish, so after Hitler came to power, he became a communist because he really hated Hitler and the persecution of the Jews. He actually went to the Soviet Union, but then got into trouble there, got put in prison in the Soviet Union. But then in 1939, Hitler and Stalin made a temporary pact to be allies. Of course, Hitler stabbed the Soviet Union in the back in Operation Barbarossa in 1940 or 41. But when they were partners, they did a prisoner exchange. So Houtermans was exchanged back to Berlin as a prisoner. Van Lau was a physicist at the University of Berlin. He knew Houtermans when he did his PhD work in Germany. So he got him out of prison, set him up working at a laboratory in Berlin. But it wasn't the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. It was a private lab in Berlin, and it was run by a wealthy German inventor. This guy was funded by the German Post Office. And the German Post Office was funneling money to this wealthy inventor who hired Houtermans because the Post Office wanted to gain favor with Hitler by being the government agency that delivered the plans for an atomic bomb to him. So it wasn't a War Department that they were working through. They were a separate German entity. So Houtermans worked there on research. And in that position, he did a report in August of 1941 from his reading literature, hearing about experiments in Germany and elsewhere. And he did a report saying that you could probably build a bomb out of plutonium 239. So he was the first to say you could actually build a bomb from plutonium 239 if you could build a reactor to then make plutonium-239 from neutron capture on uranium-238. Uranium-238 is the common isotope of uranium. It does not fission, but it can capture neutron. This is what Seaborg realized in his experiments at Berkeley, that lead decays to neptunium, which then decays to plutonium. And so that discovery was at hand from Berkeley. He realized that you could use this to make enough plutonium, theoretically, in order to build a bomb. And so after that, that's how the German effort moved. Enriching uranium was a difficult, costly process, and Heisenberg then, after he heard this report from Poodlemans, said that maybe that's the direction that our project should take, to build a reactor to make plutonium. The British work was proceeding rapidly. Frederick Lindemann was a professor from Oxford. He was made a lord by his friend, Prime Minister Churchill. So he became the United Kingdom's leading scientist during the war and after the war. He understood the report from the British uranium version of the Uranium Committee. He agreed that uranium could be enriched by gaseous diffusion. He agreed that money should be spent to build it. He talked to Churchill on August 27th, 1941 about all this, that this is indeed possible. You know, England had been involved in the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the Germans pounding London with tons and tons of bombs every night for 6 months. So England was under attack. And so Churchill agreed with him that money should be invested in seeing if you could build an atomic bomb. He argued that the isotope separation, in order to enrich uranium, should not be built in Canada, not in the US, but should probably be built in England. So that was the main question. Where would you spend the £5 million to try to do the enrichment of uranium? Mark Oliphant was an Australian physicist who worked for Rutherford in the 20s, nuclear physicist. He then set up shop at the University of Birmingham in 1937, was on the faculty there. He was the one that brought Otto Frisch, the nephew of Lisa Meitner, to England to get him out of Austria, to get out of the reach of Hitler, since Frisch was Jewish. He came in 1941 in August, flew to the US to collaborate with the people at the MIT lab on development of radar, a huge technological development that was important for the war effort to be able to detect aircraft. While he was there, he was asked by Lindemann to check with the Briggs Committee, the U.S. Uranium Committee, to see where they stood. Why were they ignoring this British report that had been sent to them a month or two ago, saying that this could be possible to build an atomic bomb to enrich uranium? He actually met with Briggs in Washington, was stunned that the chair of the Uranium Committee had not read the report or just put it in a safe and had not shared it with the Uranium Committee. He was stunned that the U.S. was just ignoring what the Brits were coming up with, that this is all possible. He actually met with the Uranium Committee, and they were shocked to hear Oliphant use the term bomb for the first time. They hardly discussed it and certainly had ignored it. And for the first time, they realized, this committee, that maybe a bomb is possible using enriched uranium. He went out to Berkeley to meet with Ernst Lawrence. Lawrence got very upset, agitated that his colleagues Bush and Conant in DC were ignoring that report, so he flew to DC. He also called his friend Arthur Compton, the Nobel laureate physicist, By this time, he was in Chicago. Then in September, these people all happened to be in Chicago at the same time. James Conant was the president of Harvard. He was serving as the chair of the National Defense Research Council in the Roosevelt administration. He was in town to get an honorary degree. Ernst Lawrence was in Chicago to give a physics talk, and Arthur Compton was now living there. So Arthur Compton invited both those guys to his home for dinner so that Compton and Lawrence could work on Conant and say, you've got to take this report of the British Committee seriously. You've got to decide what the U.S. should do about this uranium issue, this uranium problem. So they ganged up on Conant and said, you've got to stop dragging your feet. Conant was very skeptical, but he tested Lawrence's resolve by saying, okay, what are we doing? Would you drop everything in your work on cyclotrons and accelerators in Berkeley and come work on this? Be a leader in this. Give up your research and come work on the uranium program. Lawrence was a little bit stunned by that. Tables got turned on him, but he gathered his wits and said very quickly, yes, he would. And so Conant was getting a lot of pressure that he had to do something. Conant still was skeptical that this was all possible. He knew the discoveries. How could you ever enrich uranium enough to make a bomb? His old friend George Kistakowsky was a Harvard chemistry professor. Kistakowsky was born in an academic family in Russia. Kistakowsky fought in the Russian Revolution. He then escaped to Germany when those forces lost and came to Germany, got his PhD in Berlin in 1925. Decided to build his career in physics in Germany, but the German professor he respected pulled him aside and said, you're not going to make it as a Russian in German academia. Kistakowsky was not Jewish, but he wasn't German. So Kistakowsky got good advice that he needed to go elsewhere if he was going to build his career in physics. So he went to Princeton. And then Conant, president of Harvard, saw his town and recruited him to be on the chemistry faculty at Harvard. They knew each other well, and so he asked Kistakowsky, what about this uranium problem? Is this craziness possible? Could you really, in a rather short time, hope to build a bomb out of uranium-235? Kistakowsky was initially skeptical. He went off for a few weeks, studied it, came back to Conant and said that yes, a fission bomb is possible, and that you need to take it seriously. It was technically possible to build a uranium atomic bomb, although it was difficult. The official report from England came in October. Then Vannevar Bush realized he had to take this to the president. On October 9th, they went to see the president, President Roosevelt. They met with Roosevelt and his vice president, who was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was a plant geneticist, vice president of the US. So Vannevar Bush went to take these rapidly developing ideas. Bush and Conant had come to terms with the fact that they couldn't ignore this anymore. They had to take the British report and go tell Roosevelt and his vice president about this. The president agreed. The president gave him go ahead for research on uranium. Told him that still the policy and the key decision would be made not by the Uranium Committee, the physicists, the chemists, but rather by the group, a policy group that would report to the president, the vice president, secretary of war, army chief of staff, then Bush, Vannevar Bush, president of Carnegie Institution, an engineer, Conant, president of Harvard. So they got the permission to proceed in research. And it's not clear. Roosevelt was thinking maybe
more about after the war, after World War II. U.S. wasn't in World War II yet. That this would be an important weapon, not for this war, but was concerned more about future wars, perhaps. But still, they got a go-ahead from President Roosevelt. Bush and Conant asked Compton, Arthur Compton, the Nobel laureate, to go around, do another report. Now that you have to go ahead for the president, what do you do next? So Compton went around, talked to Fermi at Columbia University, and Fermi agreed that you probably needed no more than 100 pounds of uranium-235 to build a bomb. He went up to Columbia also to talk to Harold Urey, a Nobel laureate in chemistry in 1934, for the discovery of deuterium in heavy water. And Harold Urey said that you probably could enrich uranium in mass-235 through a gaseous diffusion process. And maybe you would need 5,000 separate gaseous diffusion tubes or barriers, because you just get a little bit of enrichment between 235 and 238 through each gaseous diffusion tube. So you need to spring thousands of those. That's what K-25 at ONL became. Huge building with thousands of separate gaseous diffusion tanks. He stopped in Princeton, talked to Eugene Wigner, one of the Hungarian immigrant physicists, Jewish, and Wigner explained to him fission due to slow neutrons and fast neutrons, the difference, and explained to him that you probably could make element 94 plutonium for a bomb by using neutron capture on uranium. He went to see Seaborg at Berkeley, and Seaborg explained that, yeah, if you could build a reactor, he could invent ways to do radiochemical separation of created plutonium from uranium target material in a reactor. And so then he called a meeting, finally, Bush did, of his uranium committee for October 21st. Lawrence brought Oppenheimer along. Oppenheimer had not been involved in any of these, was not on the uranium committee, was not involved in all of this thinking going on in the US. But Lawrence and Oppenheimer were friends, young faculty at Berkeley. He brought Oppenheimer along. Concern had been raised about Oppenheimer. He had leftist leanings in the 1930s. His wife was dabbled as a member of the Communist Party in the 30s. But Oppenheimer was able to attend, was allowed to attend the meeting of the Uranium Committee, and he provided real input and clarity of thought by describing the calculations, whereby describing even the blast potential of a bomb if you had 100 pounds of uranium-235. So he made contributions right away. Oppenheimer did. At the same time, things were moving rapidly in Germany. Heisenberg at the Bayer's house, the new building constructed at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, that term to scare off prowlers and passers-by. But they did an experiment similar to what Fermi and Szilard had done. Tank full of water, neutron source at the center, sheaths of uranium, natural uranium around it, measure neutrons, emitted, and found they did get an increase in the number of neutrons in that tank. It showed that multiplying neutrons, a chain reaction would be theoretically possible. And this is important because Hudemans had explained to Heisenberg that you could make plutonium by capturing neutrons at uranium-238. That's kind of what was being done in this experiment. So after that experiment, Heisenberg, the leader of the German Manhattan Project, knew what the direction was. The direction would be to try to build a reactor to make plutonium-239. And he decided he'd go visit his friend and mentor in September of 1941, Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. the Germans had occupied Denmark in April of 1940. In a year and a half since the Nazis had come in, remember they let Denmark function because they needed farm products from Denmark for German people. They let the king stay in power. The parliament was there but had no power. And then in September, after Heisenberg saw the direction for the German effort, trying to make plutonium in a reactor, he went to see his friend, his mentor, Niels Bohr, who had started working with him when Heisenberg was in his early 20s. A father figure Bohr was to Heisenberg. Well, this is the book, this is the movie about this meeting where Heisenberg visited Niels and Margareta Bohr at the Carlsberg Mansion. The most famous Danish scientist then and now lives in a very fancy house on the grounds of the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen. I visited there a time or two. The reception is really nice. So Bohr was living there. Heisenberg came to visit. This was a difficult meeting because the Nazis had occupied Denmark for a year and a half. They had dinner, it was a strained dinner. They agreed that Heisenberg and Bohr would go out and walk in the garden to talk. The talk crashed and burned. And they came in after only 5 or 10 minutes. Usually they would walk and hike and talk for hours, Bohr and Heisenberg, talking about physics. After 5 or 10 minutes, they came back from their walk. Bohr visibly upset. Bohr and Heisenberg never spoke again, even though Bohr lived till 1963. Heisenberg lived until late 60s, early 70s, but they never spoke again. So something bad happened during that walk, and that's what this play is about. What did they talk about on that ill-fated walk? Well, apparently, Heisenberg asked Bohr. So his son, Oa Bohr, who I knew until he died, also Nobel laureate in 1975, Niels told his son, Oa Bohr, that Heisenberg asked him if it were right for physicists to work on a problem at wartime if there's a chance of that research would lead to grave consequences in the technique of war. Bohr was shocked by the question and asked Heisenberg, was it technically possible to build a bomb out of uranium fission? And Heisenberg apparently replied, yes, it could be done with tremendous technical effort. And that really upset Bohr. Bohr took that to mean that Heisenberg was leading the effort to do this, to build this terrible weapon. You know, Bohr had just been in the US, and before the US wrapped their arms around the British report, and people in the US were telling them it can't be done. Yes, there is nuclear fission, but there's no way you can separate and enrich uranium-235. Can't be done. So to hear that his protege, Heisenberg, said it is technically possible, Bohr took that to mean that A, Heisenberg was going to do that in Germany, and B, that Heisenberg was pumping more for details on what the US and England were doing about this. And so he was really upset. That's why he never spoke to Heisenberg again for the rest of his life. Heisenberg maintained until he died that he was trying to send a signal to Bohr that he can control the German effort to build an atomic bomb if Bohr could get the Allies to control the effort, they could agree to back off and not build an atomic bomb. And that was Heisenberg's interpretation of the. Well, no one knows. Out of that 5-minute talk, Heisenberg and Bohr apparently had very different interpretations of what was said, what was the intent, and why it crashed and burned so badly. And that's the subject of the play Copenhagen. And I have a copy of the book. I have a copy of the DVD. One of the guys that was a James Bond, I forget his name, the late 90s, plays Heisenberg. And so it's a 90-minute movie that was made. And I haven't figured out how we would all watch that or whether there was time, but it really is. They performed it here at UT about 10 years ago. It's a play that has Heisenberg, Bohr, and Bohr's wife. And in this play, this movie, they do two renditions of the walk and the source of the disagreement. One, Bohr's interpretation, then they come back to the house. Bohr kicks Heisenberg out because he's mad at him. The other was Heisenberg's rendition of what happened in the shock at Bohr becoming so upset. That's the subject of this book, this play. Great story. Back in the US, Arthur Compton did another report after he talked to Jeremy Bigner, Lawrence, Seaborg, and came back and told the uranium committee that you could build a bomb if you had 200 kilograms of uranium-235. It would have a high blast potential, even underestimated what the blast potential would be. You could perhaps do gas distribution through separation. And there was no mention of making plutonium, but they took that to President Roosevelt November 27th, 1941, said, Mr. President, can we proceed? And this is then the reply. On January 19th, the president sent a note back to Bush, to Vannevar Bush, VP. And this is the authorization for the Manhattan Project, this hand-scribbled note by President Roosevelt. Vannevar Bush, okay, return. I think you best keep this in your own safe, FDR. So that was the go-ahead, hardly a formal document. And so that was a go-ahead to continue to really start a research program on uranium. And so these are people that made then what came to be called the Manhattan Project work. This is Lawrence, Nobel laureate, but then the cyclotron, crucial for doing these measurements on plutonium. Arthur Compton, Nobel laureate, one who did these reports, that this is all possible, especially after the British work. That's Vannevar Bush. This is Arthur Conant, president of Yale. This is Compton's brother, who was president of MIT, president of MIT, president of Harvard, and Alfred Loomis, a rich man in upstate New York who helped in the development of radar. So then the Uranium Committee met again on December 6, 1941. And they made their assignments. Vannevar Bush and Harold Conant made their assignments now that they had to go ahead for the president. They said, Yuri, you at Columbia, you should work on research on how we would do gaseous diffusion. Lawrence at Berkeley, you should proceed on how to do electromagnetic separation of uranium. A guy from Standard Oil should work on ideas of doing centrifuge enrichment of uranium. As you spin things, the heavier the molecule of uranium hexafluoride, but U-238 would migrate outward more into U-235 as the spinning. Maybe that could be a technique. Compton in Chicago would work on theoretical studies of how you would build a bomb, how you would design it. After that meeting, Arthur Compton argued that you should also include effort to see if you can build a reactor in order to breed plutonium-239, based upon the work of Fairbairn and Savard, Columbia. Bush and Connolly agreed with those assignments, adding creation of plutonium on December 6, 1941. The next day, all hell broke loose. Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese did a surprise, completely unexpected attack on Pearl Harbor. But first, understand Japan a little bit. Japan in the 20s and 30s had to import a lot of raw materials for their burgeoning economic development and growing industry. Most of these imports came from the US, so we were trading partners. They needed to be self-sufficient, they felt. You know, it's funny when you read about the Japanese that there's a certain element of the Nazis. The Nazis felt that the Aryans were superior to any other race on earth, especially the Jews. The Japanese felt in the Asian countries, the Japanese were superior than any other, superior to the Koreans and the Chinese and the Thais and the Malaysians. The same kind of mental gymnastics to prove to yourself that you're the best. Well, that's what was going on in Japan. And so they were dependent on the West for resources, natural resources, and they knew they needed to have some of their own. So that's one reason they took Manchuria. In 1931, Japan invaded northeast China, Manchuria, mostly because, technically, the natural resources there. Also because the Chinese were inferior to the Japanese. The Japanese should rule it. And so this was the movement of Japan in the 1930s. Military was taking over the government. The emperor was in charge, but becoming more militaristic, focused on military expansion, totalitarianism. So this was going on in parallel with what Hitler was doing in Germany. In 1937, Japan invaded China, not just Manchuria, but all of China. The Chinese still hate the Japanese, much like the Danes, the older Danes still hate the Germans. Because the older Danes were alive when Hitler marched in. The older Chinese were alive when Japan took China. And it was a struggle then. You had Mao Zedong, the communists, you had Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, and then you had the Japanese invading China. A very complicated war in China. On December 37, Japan took over Nanjing, or Nanking rather, the nationalist capital of China, and there was a massacre. Probably the Japanese slaughtered 300,000 people, mainly the military, but a whole lot of civilians too. Chinese still have a hard time talking about the Nanking massacre. That's why they still hate the Japanese, first of all. In 1940, then, Japan signed an agreement with Hitler, with Mussolini, that became the Axis. They would work together in furthering their own interests. Hitler wanted to take all of Europe and the US. Japan wanted to take all of Asia. In response to the Nanking massacre, we tried to be friends with Japan for a long time through the 30s. After the Nanking massacre, then we started doing embargoes. We embargoed the report of selling raw materials to Japan. Then we upped the Japan then moved into French Indochina, Vietnam, basically. Japan already had taken Korea Peninsula. put an embargo on fuel, steel, and scrap iron. That really turned up the economic screws on Japan. Oil exports stopped to Japan in July of 1941. So Japan was feeling the pinch. U.S. moved its naval fleet from San Diego out to Hawaii in mid-1941. And they saw Japan trying to expand into the Philippines. And U.S. moved their fleet out to Hawaii, still far from the Philippines, but to give them a message that they did not have free reign in all of Southeast Asia. They tried to negotiate. That collapsed in the fall of 1941. November 27th, Chief of Staff George Marshall sent a note to commanders around in the Pacific, U.S. commanders, saying, be careful. We fear trouble from the Japanese. They thought they were more worried about Japanese attack on the Philippines. Never really thought much that they'd be so bold, the Japanese, to come all that way and attack Hawaii. Too far away, too difficult. But that's what did happen. I'll come back to that. So Yamamoto planned the surprise attack. Yamamoto, an interesting guy. He was born with a different name, a different family, but he was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a wealthy family in Japan. That was common. If you were a wealthy Japanese family who didn't have a son, you would adopt a son so that your family name would continue. And that was Yamamoto. He was educated in the U.S. He studied at Naval College. He studied at Harvard. He knew the U.S. well. He opposed the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. He opposed the war with China in 1937. He opposed the agreement with Germany and Italy. That meant he was not very popular in Japan. Indeed, the Navy minister, he was in the Navy, he was a commander in the Navy. He knew that he believed in Yamamoto because he was so smart, so hardworking, but he knew that he was unpopular because he was opposed to these aggressive tendencies of Japan. So he made him commander-in-chief of the combined fleet in August of 1939. And so he wouldn't be assassinated in mainland Japan. He was also opposed to war with the U.S. because he had studied at Harvard and the Naval Academy, the Naval College, and had worked as an attaché in Washington. However, then when Tojo was appointed prime minister in October of 1941, prime minister was a big army supporter, and he was also he was an enemy of Yamamoto, but Yamamoto was so talented he kept him in his cabinet as commander-in-chief of the combined naval fleet. But then told Yamamoto to plan a surprise attack on the U.S. So in the spring of 1941, full-scale planning in Japan started on a surprise attack of the U.S. Pilots were trained, torpedoes were built, planes were built, and throughout the summer, this was under active planning. The emperor did not approve it until November 5th and did not give final authorization of the attack on Pearl Harbor to December 1st, 6 days before Pearl Harbor attack occurred. And the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor is something very bold, something very difficult. It was to prevent the American fleet from interfering in Japanese expansionistic tendencies in Southeast Asia. Also, they wanted to wipe out the U.S. Navy before they could build. Also, was to discourage the Americans from getting involved, to deal a killing blow to the U.S. Navy if you could attack and destroy Pearl Harbor. So the emperor gave his permission to proceed on November 5th. November 26th, a fleet of 6 aircraft carriers departed Japan to go across the Pacific toward Hawaii. They had 408 aircraft, 360 were attack planes. And this was what Yamamoto planned. Now there's technology development needed here. The problem was that the harbor in the depth of the water in Pearl Harbor is only 40 feet. And normal torpedoes dropped by aircraft at that time would then sink to a depth of 70 feet before they gained their stability and then went toward a ship, for example. So they had to do R&D to have a different kind of torpedo that could stabilize before the floor of the bay, 40 feet, came about. And the pilots had to learn to come in slow and low to drop those torpedoes so they would be effective at these shallow depths. There was a crash program then to build new torpedoes. Things were added to make them work in the shallow water. And this crash program got enough torpedoes built by the time the fleet left on November 27th. Ironically, the company that did most of those construction of 108 torpedoes was upriver from Nagasaki, where the second atomic bomb was dropped a couple years later. December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. 7 a.m. There was a radar station. Radar had been improved and implemented partially. A radar station, 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, picked up a signal on the North Point. Aircraft coming in. But it was more or less ignored. Maybe 50 planes coming in from the northeast, 132 miles away. And that's a bigger radar signal than anybody had seen. 2 Army privates called the commander in the south part of Oahu to say, there's planes coming in. However, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler thought this was a planned arrival of 6 B-17s. He knew he was coming to Oahu sometime soon to bolster the aircraft force in Hawaii. So he told the private to ignore the signal, but this was probably just the B-17s coming in. Well, that was a huge mistake. So the attack began at 7:48. 353 Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. 7:58, the Ford Island commander sent out a radio signal, air attack on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. So this is a complete shock. Yeah.
Was the lieutenant put on trial for negligence?
I forget. You remember?
Something I thought he was in.
I don't remember.
He may have been. Probably was. I don't remember what happened.
Okay. I feel like I remember hearing something about that recently.
I think you're probably right. I have to check on that. So here's Pearl Harbor. The aircraft carriers coming in that direction. And they attacked Pearl Harbor Sunday morning. I visited there. And there's a museum. I got this photograph, just a big wall hanging. And so you see here's Ford Island, here's the airfield. The Japanese tried to attack battleships. Just about all the U.S. battleships were here. Battleships were the most glorious part of the any Navy at that time. So here's 2, 4, 6, 8. 2, 2, maybe that's just 1, 2, 4, 6. I guess that's 1, another one. 8 battleships here, all lined up. Sitting ducks. At 7:48, the attack began. The Arizona was hit and sank right away. Arizona is number 6. So that got hit right away. Sank. 3 torpedoes hit the California. This one here, sitting duck. 2 torpedoes hit the West Virginia, number 5. The outer one here. Torpedo took out the Nevada. Nevada was number 7. This one back here. 2,000 Americans died. 1,000 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk, including 5 battleships. Huge part of the U.S. Navy. Many of the aircraft, 400 American aircraft, were there on Ford Island. They weren't prepared to get up and defend. Half of them were destroyed. So it was a huge, devastating attack by the Japanese. And this, I love this photograph. See, here's a Japanese plane. It just dropped a torpedo and hit to West Virginia. West Virginia was, which one here? West Virginia, number 5. So that's a photograph taken by a Japanese plane as the colleague that dropped the torpedo hit the Arizona, hit the West Virginia, and it blew up. So here's another airplane. 300 planes were coming from all directions. Chaos reigned. So that's the California sinking, the West Virginia sinking. Just a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Next day, we declared war on Germany, Italy, and Japan. We managed to be out of the war. The U.S. between World War I and II was an isolationist country. After Pearl Harbor, we became partners in the war. And now, you know, this was serious business. We were, of course, knowing that this might happen, but we did not know we'd get into the war this way. Some of the battleships were repaired and later went back, got into the war. Junior officers on those attacking aircraft carriers argued that the leader should make another attack, a third. There were 2 waves that morning, that Sunday morning, that he argued there should be a 3rd wave to not only sink the battleships, but to attack the torpedo storage, the maintenance, the dry storage facilities, and really put in the final nail in the coffin. But the leader of that on board leader thought that was too dangerous, decided not to. And the stories have debated ever since that if he had done that, we would not have been able to recover as rapidly as we did, even though it took time. So that's Pearl Harbor. Then everything got very serious. Then the Manhattan Project really took off. Now we were in the war. And so everything changed on December 7th, 1941. All right.